Even if you'd never heard of ketamine before, there's a good chance that you became aware of the drug after this awful news broke.
The results from Matthew Perry's autopsy have been released today. The 54-year-old Friends actor died after drowning in his pool on October 28th. Investigators say that was just one factor in his death, and our Hillary Johnstone.
With the death of actor Matthew Perry, suddenly we were learning a lot about the uses and abuses of ketamine.
Hillary, this report cites acute effects of ketamine as contributing to Perry's death.
But there's also a pretty good chance that you already have some firsthand or at least arm's length experience with ketamine yourself. Over the last decade especially, ketamine has grown in popularity as a party drug. But at the same time, it's also come into the mainstream as an aid to psychotherapy and counseling.
What we're trying to get at with psychedelic-assisted therapy is helping individuals heal.
Ketamine is the poster child for a paradigm shift in how we think about treating depression.
It all makes it seem as though ketamine is something new, but it's actually been around for about 60 years. And in this episode of On Drugs, we're going to give you a brief and selective history of the drug sometimes known as Special K. We're going to hear how this drug went from a laboratory in Detroit to the mainstream of recreational and therapeutic drug use. But before we can even begin to understand ketamine, we have to talk about phencyclidine piperidine, or PCP. Bita Moghaddam is a neuroscientist at the Oregon Health and Science University, and she's written a book about the history and science of ketamine. I'll let her explain where PCP came from.
PCP had been synthesized somewhat accidentally a few years earlier. It was tested in animals, and in monkeys, it was found to have this sort of calming serenity effect, for lack of a better term. So that led researchers to think that the drug may have anesthetic properties. Now, keep in mind that this was 40s and 50s, and there was an acute need for better anesthetics that were not fatal. So PCP looked very good in that people at high dose of PCP appeared to be anesthetized, and it didn't have the fatal side effects that typical anesthetics have. The problem is that when it went to clinical trial, people woke up from it psychotic, essentially.
Waking up psychotic definitely seems like a drawback. Doctors call that temporary state emergence delirium. And depending on the person, that experience can be dreamlike and hallucinatory. It can make you feel dissociated from yourself and completely disconnected from your body, in a pleasant way. For some people, the experience is euphoric, but for others, it's downright nightmarish. So it was taken off the market in 1965. But you know how people are with drugs. One person's apocalyptic hallucination is another's psychedelic journey of self-discovery. And pretty much as fast as PCP was pulled from the market, it started showing up on the streets as a recreational drug. And that's when it earned the nickname angel dust. It's also where it earned a very bad reputation.
Now the same chemical made in underground labs has become a major drug problem in most large cities in the United States. In Los Angeles, PCP-related arrests have risen 2,000% in the last 4 years.
This part is going to be tough sledding for me, thanks to a very frightening TV special that aired in 1979. The experience of watching it left many of my generation more than a little traumatized. The documentary was called Angel Death, and it was hosted by Paul Newman and his wife Joanne Woodward. It was meant to raise awareness about the scourge of angel dust. It gave the impression that the drug was spreading like wildfire, and the descriptions of its effects were nightmarish.
Zombie, space cadet, rubberhead, burnout. These are street terms for a condition doctors call chronic brain syndrome. It is caused by repeated use of PCP, even in low doses.
In one scene, a woman describes being so out of it, she watched her friend drown in a swimming pool without even trying to take action.
Candy, how old are you now?
12.
How old were you when you first started smoking angel dust?
11.
Now, I don't know how many 11-year-olds were actually taking PCP at the time, but this was not an era known for nuance or veracity in reporting on drugs. Mind you, Angel Death was Pulitzer-worthy when compared to this magnificent cultural moment.
In the top of the news tonight, another tragic death due to the killer drug, Angel Dust.
The movie is called Death Drug. Subtle, right? And it stars Philip Michael Thomas as Jesse Thomas, a plumber with a promising music career. Unfortunately, just as Jesse gets signed to a recording contract, a local drug dealer gets him hooked on PCP.
Hey, Jesse, come on. I seen you here trying to get high on that old burnout weed.
I ain't got no complaints, John.
Now with this, you can really get down, Jesse. This'll give you a high you won't soon forget.
Jesse's career is taking off, but thanks to all the angel dust he's smoking, his life is derailed by escalating hallucinations and psychotic delusions. These are brought to life with some laughable special effects. One minute, Jesse is horrified by a vision of rats in the oranges at the supermarket. Next thing you know, he's run down by a truck that he's mistaken for a monster.
Grammy-nominated singer-songwriter Jesse Thomas was killed this evening when he ran in front of an oncoming truck not far from a supermarket where he and his wife had been shopping earlier.
All because he took that first puff of the death drug, PCP. Death Drug is a fascinating artifact, and it's also pretty awesome because it includes appearances by the electro-funk legends the Gap Band playing themselves. It is not a high point of auteur cinema, and safe to say it's a little off base in its portrayal of the trajectory of PCP addiction. But along with Angel Death, it helped give PCP a really bad name. I remember as a teenager there was this paranoia about the risk of buying cannabis laced with PCP. I'm pretty sure that never actually happened to anyone I knew, but it was a good story to tell for one of those times when maybe you got just a little too stoned on your buddy's homegrown. Even at the peak of angel dust panic, it was not an especially popular recreational drug for all sorts of reasons. The high that it produces is not for everyone. It can be a real mind bender where you feel utterly dissociated from yourself. And then there are those pesky psychotic episodes. I read a quote from a nurse at the Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital in New York. She said that when a patient is brought in after an episode of public nudity, they can almost guarantee that PCP is the culprit. And whether it was because of the campaign against it or because it's just too problematic, PCP declined in popularity pretty quickly. It still has pockets of use in a few cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, but it's almost exclusively used in the US. The Park Davis Company realized early on that PCP was not going to be a viable option for anesthesia, thanks to those side effects. But it felt like they were really close to getting it right, so they went back to the lab. Here's Bita Moghaddam again.
The idea that a drug like PCP could be used as an anesthetic didn't die down, so that then a lot of researchers started trying to synthesize drugs that had this very similar structure as PCP, but were shorter acting. And ketamine is exactly that. It acts very much like PCP or angel dust, acts on almost identical brain receptors. The structure is very similar. The main difference is that PCP's effect lasts for hours, whereas ketamine's effect lasts for minutes. So it very quickly was pushed through clinical trials, and FDA approved it as an anesthetic, and it became a very useful anesthetic for combat during Vietnam, which was raging in the 60s, and has remained an anesthetic and a very useful tool, not only in combat, but in emergency situations where you don't have access to a surgical suite.
The first account that I could find of ketamine on the battlefield was not from Vietnam, but from the Middle East. In September of 1970, hostilities broke out between the Palestinian Liberation Army and the Jordanian Army. The situation got really ugly really fast. With casualties mounting, King Hussein reached out to British, French, and American governments for medical aid. Well, it turns out that the British Field Hospital had ketamine in its supplies when it set up shop in Jordan. Keep in mind that the drug had only been approved for clinical trials in Britain 8 months earlier. Many of the casualties were burn victims, and many of them were children in terror and pain. Nurses and doctors quickly found that ketamine was extraordinarily effective in that setting. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic, so the dosage put the children in a trance-like state for about 20 minutes, often long enough to deliver the emergency treatment required in less than ideal circumstances. In researching an episode about anesthesia, I learned how modern anesthetic procedures typically involve 3 or 4 different drugs: a hypnotic to knock you out, analgesic to suppress pain, an amnesiac to suppress memories of surgery, and paralytics to immobilize muscles. Well, ketamine is the only anesthetic that does the first 3 all on its own. That's really valuable in a situation where your hospital might consist of a helicopter evading enemy fire. It's also really easy for non-professionals to administer ketamine without risk of overdose. And Bita Moghaddam says that ketamine has proven valuable for pain relief in a different setting, folks dealing with chronic pain.
Before the hype with the antidepressant effects of ketamine started, I would say that the hottest thing about ketamine was in pain clinics. There were actually pain clinics and they're still around, and individuals who are not responding to anything else with chronic pain, ketamine infusions help with pain. So the question is, how is that working? We don't have a very clear idea of how it works as pain relief. But ketamine, because it blocks one of the most common receptors in the brain, the glutamate NMDA receptor, those receptors are everywhere. So one of the ideas about how it works as a dissociative anesthetic, or how it reduces pain perception, other perceptions, is that it is actually reducing the connectivity between neurons. So neurons in different brain regions can no longer communicate with each other. So that transmission is reducing. So that could be why you feel disconnected. So different brain regions are disconnecting from each other, in other words, and that may cause the disconnection from pain or disconnection from reality.
One of the things that ketamine has going for it is that it's a dirty drug. No, really.
A dirty drug is a valid pharmacological term for a drug that acts on many receptors in the brain. So it's not highly specific.
So at the risk of getting too sciencey, ketamine is a bit messy in the brain. It's acting on a bunch of different kinds of receptors at the same time. For all of these reasons, it's also become a go-to for pediatric medicine, especially in situations where a short, painful treatment is required. In procedures where an adult might be expected to tough it out with a bit of pain, it can be essential to sedate a child patient. I watched this YouTube video of a young boy who suffered a big gash in his upper lip. He's frightened and in obvious pain. But he's given ketamine intravenously, and right before your eyes, you see him disappear into the trance. Doctors immediately get down to business with the boy's mother right there in the room. The boy is stitched up, and in just a few minutes, he's come around again.
Waking up. Hi, my love. Hey, big boy. Still got a little staying what's going on in those eyes, but he's waking up.
But ketamine is not perfect. In the accounts from that conflict in Jordan, several of the children experienced awful hallucinations as the ketamine wore off. That's something that ketamine shares with PCP, although not to the same degree. It can have really trippy effects that unroot you from reality. The effects are so dramatic that researchers actually use it as a stand-in for the experience of schizophrenia. Here's Bita Moghaddam again.
Schizophrenia is a debilitating, devastating illness. And our treatment for schizophrenia really have not improved since the 50s when the current antipsychotic drugs were discovered. And those treatments are suboptimal. They only help some of the symptoms in some individuals. So the idea was that you give healthy humans an infusion of ketamine, low-dose ketamine, and then you see how, as they start having these symptoms or behaviors that are relevant to schizophrenia, sense of detachment, hallucinations, thought disorder, you could actually be imaging their brain to see what brain systems are being disengaged or engaged to better understand what are the networks that are involved potentially in these symptoms that are relevant to schizophrenia.
So in other words, the brain on ketamine acts enough like a schizophrenic brain that doctors hope to gain some insight into how that disease works in the brain. As the picture becomes clearer, they might be able to formulate effective treatments. That would be absolutely wonderful news, but it also makes you wonder, if this drug can literally simulate the effects of a devastating mental illness, well, why would anyone want to take it for fun? But of course, I know damned well that's exactly why people want to take it for fun. Sometimes nightmares are fun. Sometimes you want to get on that roller coaster. When I was a teenager, we used to love this underground comic book called The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. It chronicled the adventures of three hippie buddies in their squalid and drug-obsessed existence in the Bay Area. In one of the books from 1975, the pals wind up partying with a rock star in Hollywood. The friend presents them with some lines of powder. After snorting up the lines, one of the brothers expresses his delight because they haven't had cocaine in ages. To which the rock star friend replies, "That's not cocaine, it's ketamine. It's very decadent. It makes you have a 3-day nightmare." In the next panel, the brothers are being terrorized by flying dragons or something. So as early as 1975, ketamine was on the radar of adventurous drug users. Maybe the most adventurous of all was a guy named John C. Lilly. He was an American physician and neuroscientist who spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to talk to dolphins. He even gave them LSD. And he was also a very adventurous psychonaut. He did a lot of extensive exploration of the combined effects of isolation tanks and hallucinogenic drugs, including psilocybin, LSD, and, you guessed it, ketamine.
If you OD on this, you go out for 7 days, you're looking at this robotic body, you're running from someplace up there. It's a very strange reality. You compress your external reality, your internal reality, and your extraterrestrial reality all in one. And it's a funny trip. You make talks like this one.
This is from a lecture he gave in Colorado in 1974. He was clearly way ahead of the curve on ketamine, and he's definitely using the stuff in that time-honored tradition of psychonauts. He's tripping in hopes of getting access to an otherwise unattainable level of consciousness and insight.
Okay, very popular. A lot of you probably had it and didn't know it. Came back from your trips, and we call it nirvanagenic. Guarantees samadhi whether you like it or not.
In case you missed that, he said that ketamine guarantees samadhi. In many Eastern spiritual traditions, including Buddhism and Hinduism, samadhi is a very elevated state. According to Britannica, samadhi is a state of profound and utterly absorptive contemplation of the absolute that is undisturbed by desire, anger, or any other ego-generated thoughts or emotion. I mean, I could use some of that, honestly. Listening to him talk, I get moments where I think I'm just not smart enough to comprehend the experience he's conveying and the wisdom he's attained. In other moments, I think, wow, this guy really fried his brain with all those drugs.
Step in the tank up at the community school, for which this benefit is being held, and you can disappear into a moneyless zero full of ketamine and meet those other creatures who created all this and of whom we are the robots and they are the game players. They exist on one of the planets of surrounding Jupiter, and back we'll come, make an Earth because we need an Earth. Mars is too hot. resembles aspen in the summer.
What's really interesting to me is that from John C. Lilly and his dolphins or the Freak Brothers nightmare trips, it's clear that in just 10 years of existence, ketamine had secured a place in the drug culture on both sides of the regulatory fence. By the 1990s, ketamine had become a staple of European and British dance culture. But it actually seems to have found earlier popularity in Asia. One researcher traced the connection back to Goa, India. Apparently, some European DJs were experimenting with ketamine at beach parties in Goa where the drug was available over the counter. They brought it back and introduced it to the warehouse dance scene in Europe. The British electronic duo The Chemical Brothers were at the leading edge of that culture with their fusion of rock and techno dance beats. In 1997, their second album, Dig Your Own Hole, reached #1 on the UK charts. And on that album is the song that you're hearing now. It's called Lost in the K-Hole. And what is a K-hole, you ask? Well, here are some clues.
So let me take you along in the wondrous world of a K-hole.
This is the point where you start to lose touch with the entire process, the entire room. So here we go.
And suddenly things got very strange. And there seemed to be a distinct lag between my thoughts, my mouth moving, and me hearing any sound, which makes it very hard to talk.
It sort of looked like everything was drawn, so I wouldn't see much depth. You can have dissociation from your body, which is also pretty fun.
It was wild. I was above my body looking down, floating.
That is an assortment of internet people describing the K-hole experience. It's basically what happens when you take a high enough dose of ketamine that you essentially lose environmental and even bodily awareness. It's a very intense form of dissociation and derealization where you can't even interact with the world and people around you. Well, that sure sounds like a party drug to me. I wish I had some brilliant personal insight into the reasons that ketamine contends with ecstasy as a go-to club culture drug, but I just don't. So I've asked for some help with that.
Yeah, so I would describe it as kind of queer nightlife, specifically like electronic music, raves, and with a more accessible like poppy element.
That's the voice of someone we're calling John. He's a dance club promoter, and he's also very experienced with ketamine, including the K-hole experience. I met him at one of the spaces where he puts on dance events.
My most recent K-hole that I remember was probably like last year, and it was like quite pleasant. I was in one of my friends' houses, and it was really psychedelic. I felt like I was in a really high budget like Pixar movie. It was like everything was 3D, and obviously I was just sitting in a fucking lawn chair. But yeah, that was like quite good. I guess, yeah. Did we mention that sometimes K-holes are fun?
Here in the dance space, there are some comfy couches where I can picture people flaking out on ketamine. But I wanted to know where the drug fits into the dance part of the culture.
The place in dance culture. So I personally love its effects on how I dance. I am a lot less inhibited and I feel like I move better. I don't know whether objectively that's true or not. I've also seen the opposition say that ketamine is ruining dance culture. I saw a tweet recently that people were saying that the dance floor looked like it was full of zombies, most likely because of ketamine. And to that, I say that drugs kind of affect everyone differently. I've never really felt low energy when I do it, but I do also know that people sometimes, like my friends, will take a bump and they're just like on the couch for the entire night. And I can't really explain that other than the fact that drugs affect everyone differently. Like I personally don't do mushrooms because I don't really know how to describe it other than like psychosis. And but all my friends love it.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I've never tried ketamine myself, but every description I've heard of the effects of ketamine makes me feel like, well, that sounds like the opposite of a party drug. Like, it makes sense to me when people say, yeah, I did coke or I did Molly and I hit the dance floor. I think what you might be describing there is the K-hole that people are going into.
Yes.
How does that work in a party setting?
Ideally, you would not K-hole in a party setting, but unfortunately, it just happens. This can be due to a lot of things. This usually is when, honestly, I've seen a lot of coke users K-hole because they don't ask what the bag is, and they assume it's coke, and their greedy nostrils take a big ass bump of cat, and they're like just down for like 2 hours. And it's just kind of like a learning experience to ask people what's in the bag. But other than that, another reason that people K-hole is usually it's like they get a bump from their friend who's quite experienced and has a high tolerance. And usually this amount is not for people newly onboarding onto this drug.
So it sounds like you've got a fair bit of experience with ketamine, and I assume that you dial in your dosage to avoid that when you want to dance?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, I think I do it enough where my tolerance is so high that I really would need an absurd amount to K-hole at this point.
You said that you take ketamine quite often. What does that mean, often?
Honestly, it means like 3 to 5 times a week. And I know people, that's going to sound quite high, but I would say social drinkers maybe drink like a beer or a wine a day, every day. Is that accurate? I don't know.
Or more. In my case, before I stopped drinking, I drank way more than that.
Oh, really? Oh, cool. Yeah. That's not judgment at all. It's just sometimes when people think of that, like they maybe it seems like a really extreme number, but if we're comparing it to alcohol, and also you actually mentioned something about hangovers earlier. Ketamine doesn't actually give you a hangover like alcohol does. Obviously, you can feel like shit if you do too much, and if you don't sleep because you've done too much. But I've never experienced a ketamine hangover.
So maybe there's no hangover when you take ketamine. But what happens to you when you're in the middle of a bumping club and you find yourself deep in a K-hole? That seems like it might be a bit of a vulnerable position to be in, though. Potentially you're surrounded by strangers, and to be sort of out of control of your body. How do you guard against that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up. I feel really thankful that we throw like queer nightlife, and there is a focus on kind of like community care in some ways, where at every event at this venue and every event that I throw, regardless of what venue it is, we hire harm reduction people, and these people just patrol to make sure no one's being creepy, making sure if anyone's too drunk or too high or like K-holing, they're like, someone is kind of tending to them, making sure they're staying hydrated, and making sure security doesn't kick them out until, they don't get kicked out. They're just, if they want to leave, we wait until they're like ready and I guess able to be in a cab alone to go home. But I do know that obviously not all events and all clubbing experiences are like that. So yes, it is a very vulnerable position to be in if you're in a K-hole and you're not with your friends or like with harm reduction staff.
Do you have a sense of how popular ketamine is in the scene or among young people generally? Do you think it's getting more popular, or is it just sort of there like it's always been?
I want to say it's kind of been there like it's always been. I've probably introduced ketamine to a few of my friends and they've liked it. I've also introduced ketamine to my friends and they've hated it. But I would say still cocaine is way more used than ketamine, and probably MDMA as well. I wouldn't say it's like an indie subculture drug or anything by any means, but it's, in terms of popularity, I don't think it's changed throughout my time. I want to say that I kind of you know how it has a really bad reputation, ketamine? We're not going to mince words. It has a really tacky reputation. But I will say that sexy people like myself have really fought for the image of ketamine, I think, which that is arguable, though.
I am definitely not going to dispute John's sexiness, but I'm not in a position to comment on ketamine's sexiness because I've still never tried it. But John's assessment seems to line up with the statistics. Ketamine is still a pretty niche drug. In Britain, where it seems to be very common, drug use surveys show it's not even a third as popular as cocaine and a tenth as commonly used as cannabis. It's possible that Special K has peaked as a party drug, but especially in the last decade, it's found a surprising new potential market.
A clinic in Mississauga is using ketamine to treat depression. According to some experts, ketamine is more efficient in treating depression compared to other types of antidepressants. Currently in Canada, though...
Here in Canada, ketamine has been approved as a treatment for depression, especially pernicious treatment-resistant depression. My colleague Julian Uzielli has made an excellent documentary about his experience with that, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But I also wanted to talk to Julian for a little insight and a bit of an update. He began by telling me about the circumstances that brought him to ketamine.
I was off work on stress leave. It was the middle of the pandemic lockdowns. I already had depression before that, and I was just sort of like overwhelmed with the world, and I was like non-functionally depressed and like couldn't get out of bed and that whole thing. And my doctor had basically made me take some time off work, and I thought like, okay, well, I've never had to do this before, so this is serious. I guess I should try and figure out what I'm going to do, because I was already on medication, I was already in therapy, and that was obviously not doing the job anymore, and I needed something different. And I had heard about, I'd read articles like in Vice and stuff like that about like psychedelic therapy, about like magic mushrooms or whatever. And I thought like, I'm pretty sure that's not legal in Canada, but I'm going to Google it and just see. And it wasn't. But what I learned was that there's this thing called ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. At the time, I didn't know that much about ketamine, but I read about it and saw that it could be effective as a treatment for depression. And I was basically ready to try anything. And I thought like, look, if this has a chance of helping me out, I'm going to try it.
To get into the program, Julian had to consult a psychiatrist who confirmed that his depression warranted this new approach. That was followed by an initial therapy visit, followed by 6 ketamine sessions of escalating dosage.
And I've heard the term K-hole, and I was like, so am I going to go into a K-hole? Is did I take too much if I went into a K-hole? And she was like, no, that's kind of what we're trying to go for here. They don't call it that. They call it something more clinical, I'm sure. But the effect that they're trying to induce is what is sometimes called a K-hole, where you're basically like, you feel like you're in a hole. Like you feel like you're stuck in the chair that you're in, like you can't move, you can't get out, you're like sunken within yourself. And there's all kind of, when I describe it that way, it might sound kind of like scary, but it's not. It's all of that. And also it feels very relaxing and calm, and because it's a tranquilizer, right? Like that's what it does. You just feel extremely, extremely relaxed. And then the actual K-hole thing is like, some people describe it as an out-of-body experience. I've always struggled with finding the words to describe it, because I guess out-of-body is a good way in one sense, except that like for me it was almost like I didn't have a body, I was just consciousness. And part of this I think is probably influenced in a big way by the setting that I was in. Like I was in this dimly lit room in a big comfy chair, wearing effectively a blindfold and headphones that were playing like weird trippy music.
But the actual drugs are only part of the therapeutic experience.
For me, I was in that state for about an hour, and then after about an hour, the most intense effects start to wear off. And at that point, take off the blindfold and the headphones. They would bring in like a little snack for me and like some water. And then I would sit and talk to the therapist about
what I was thinking and feeling. And in some cases, that was the things that I experienced under the influence of ketamine were like completely abstract. Like it would just be like lights and colors and, you know, stereotypical psychedelic type stuff. And other times it would be like I'm reliving a memory from my childhood, only I'm literally a fly on the wall looking down at myself in a classroom. Or like other times it would be like just some made up thing that I was experiencing. I imagined myself as BoJack Horseman at one point.
Julian says that from the very first session, he was feeling the benefit. And by the end of the 6th session, he was experiencing profound change.
And then I felt about halfway through the 6 sessions, which took place over 3 weeks, about halfway through the 3 weeks, I was starting to feel pretty good. And then by the end of it, I felt like amazing, like almost like in a bad, like manic. And that feeling did fade over time, I should say. That kind of like almost manic feeling, I call it like the afterglow, that probably lasted a month or two, and to a lesser extent for a while after that as well. But it's now been a little over 3 years since that first session, and the depression has never come back as strong as it was before then. I have felt depressed since then. I've had some bad days, you know. Also, my life is a lot different than it was then. You know, I live in a different city now. I became a father. That has been a big source of joy and stress. I still take medication. I still do therapy, not as often as I used to need it, which is nice. I'm generally better off now for sure than I was before. Yeah.
So Julian has had a breakthrough with depression he's dealt with since his teen, and he's not alone. There's a growing number of people who testify to life-changing improvement thanks to ketamine-assisted therapy. The science is evolving on exactly how much of it is the ketamine and how much of it is the talk therapy, but it seems to be the two pieces in concert that make the difference. But as they say, there is nothing new under the sun. And it turns out that the possibilities for ketamine as a therapy for depression and other mental illness was apparent a long time ago. Here's Bita Moghaddam again.
So I found this paper, unfortunately, after the book was published. Early 70s, the first published record that I could find of ketamine working in very sick patients in a psychiatric inpatient unit. And they essentially gave 1 to 2 doses of ketamine in combination with psychotherapy. And the patients were ranged from essentially anybody except those with psychosis and schizophrenia. So depressed patients to really anxious patients. So they reported that there was enormous improvement up to 6 months, in some patients up to a year, after 2 episodes of ketamine being combined with psychotherapy, which was pretty. And they recommend, actually they declared that they recommend that that there was just a complete breakthrough with psychotherapy in these patients when it was combined with ketamine.
Yeah, so sometimes it can take a minute for the medical mainstream to catch up to the leading edge of science. I started this episode with mention of the death of actor Matthew Perry. His death seems to have happened at the collision of ketamine as a therapeutic and a recreational drug. And I sometimes wonder if that's even a worthwhile distinction. We know that Perry was receiving regular, ostensibly therapeutic infusions of ketamine from a doctor. But according to the autopsy report, the levels of ketamine in Perry's system were far beyond therapeutic levels. One medical analyst said they were at the level required for surgical anesthesia. And given that, it's likely Perry would not have been able to hold his head above water in the pool in which he drowned. We don't know exactly what was going on in Perry's life at the time of his death. We do know that he had spoken and written about his struggles with drug addiction, and a clearer picture might appear in court. In August of last year, 5 defendants, including 2 doctors, were charged in connection with his death. One of those doctors, Mark Chavez, pleaded guilty to charges of conspiring to distribute ketamine. The prosecutors allege that those charged conspired to supply Perry with ketamine, going so far as to teach him how to inject the drug himself. They allege that one of them injected Perry on the morning of his death. And his death is a reminder that ketamine is not a joke. It's true that overdose deaths by ketamine alone are very rare. The vast majority of overdose deaths related to ketamine also involve fentanyl, cocaine, or meth. But ketamine does have very dramatic physiological effects, like it can dangerously increase blood pressure, for example. But I've read about a number of deaths connected with ketamine that are very similar to Perry's. The user's consciousness is so hindered that they succumb to an otherwise innocuous situation. They drown in a bathtub or they die of hypothermia, etc. And big doses of ketamine just make you very vulnerable. If you're not with someone sober enough to look out for you, you can be prey. It's been used to facilitate rape and theft. Also, it can damage the tissue in your bladder, leading to incontinence and urinary tract blockages. It's called ketamine bladder syndrome. That said, it also seems that we're only just beginning to discover the therapeutic potential of ketamine. We're going to go even deeper on that subject in our next episode when I sit down with Hilary McBride. Hilary is the host of CBC podcast's Other People's Problems, and in her upcoming season, she explores ketamine-assisted therapy as a therapist and as a patient.
The way we do that is to be with the gnarliest, most painful, most unconscious, fears and memories and emotions that we've had.
On Drugs is produced by me and Hadil Abdelnabi. Sound design by Graham McDonald. Special thanks to Edziu Loverin for research work. Our executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is Senior Manager of CBC Podcasts. Arif Narani is the Director of CBC Podcasts. Thanks for listening.